She walked into the dinner as the family's biggest disappointment. But when they discovered who she had become, the entire room fell silent. And then her cousin, who once humiliated her, made a mistake he would regret forever. Emily Carter took a deep breath before stepping out of her car. The large Parker estate loomed in front of her, glowing under the warm evening lights. Through the tall windows, she could already hear the chatter, the clinking of glasses, and the laughter. Laughter she knew all too well. She hesitated for a moment, gripping her purse tightly. Why had she even come? She knew exactly how this night would go. But declining the invitation would only give them more reasons to talk behind her back. Taking another deep breath, she walked through the grand entrance. The dining hall was just as extravagant as she remembered. Crystal chandeliers, velvet drapes, a long mahogany table set with fine china. At the center of it all, her Aunt Margaret stood, regal as ever, welcoming guests with a practiced smile. "Emily," Margaret said, her tone dripping with fake warmth. "You actually came." Emily forced a polite smile. "You did. Thanks for the invitation." Margaret's eyes quickly scanned her outfit. Simple, elegant, but nothing that screamed luxury. A smirk flickered on her lips. "Well, we do try to include everyone in the family, no matter their circumstances." Emily swallowed the sting of the comment and moved toward the table, where the guests were settling in. She barely had time to sit before her cousin Ethan leaned over, grinning like a predator who had just spotted an easy target. "Still waiting for that big break, Em?" he asked, swirling the wine in his glass. A few chuckles echoed around the table. Emily clenched her fists under the tablecloth. "I'm working on it," she said evenly. Ethan laughed, shaking his head. "Come on, you can't still be chasing that little dream of yours." "What was it again?" "A marketing business." More laughter. Even some of the older relatives exchanged knowing glances. Emily's face burned, but she refused to let them see her break. "Well, Ethan, some of us don't have the luxury of Daddy's money to fall back on," she said calmly, taking a sip of her water. The laughter died down slightly, but Ethan wasn't done. "Oh, relax," he said, grinning. "I'm just saying, at some point you have to accept reality. Not everyone is meant for success." The words hit harder than Emily wanted to admit. Because deep down, a part of her feared he was right. She had spent years trying, failing, trying again. Yet she was still sitting at this table, being laughed at like nothing had changed. Margaret chimed in with a condescending sigh. "Sweetheart, maybe Ethan has a point. You've always been ambitious, but sometimes it's important to know when to move on." Emily's grip on her fork tightened. They were dismissing her, reducing her to nothing more than a family failure. And maybe, just maybe, tonight was the night she realized something. She would never let this happen again. As laughter and conversation continued around her, Emily sat quietly, her mind already making a decision that would change everything. She was done being the joke of the family. One day, they would regret ever underestimating her. Emily left the Parker estate that night feeling like a part of her had shattered. But deep down, something else had ignited. It wasn't just humiliation. It was determination. The cold night air hit her as she stepped onto the quiet street. She gripped the steering wheel of her old car, staring ahead. The laughter from the dinner still rang in her ears. Ethan's smug grin. Margaret's patronizing voice. The silent agreement of the others. She had let them laugh. But that was the last time. For years, Emily had dreamed of success. But dreaming wasn't enough. She needed to take action, real, concrete action. She couldn't just keep working paycheck to paycheck, hoping for a lucky break. The next morning, she sat at her tiny kitchen table, scrolling through job postings. Nothing promising. Most required experience she didn't have or degrees she couldn't afford. Her bank account was barely surviving. She sighed, rubbing her temples. What could she do? Then a notification popped up. Free online course. Marketing and digital strategy. Her heartbeat quickened. She clicked on it. A free certification. It wouldn't be easy. It required late nights, discipline, but it was a start. Emily signed up immediately. For the next few weeks, she barely slept. After working long hours as a waitress, she would come home, grab a coffee, and dive into lectures, tutorials, and assignments. It was exhausting, and sometimes doubt crept in. One evening, after spilling coffee on her laptop and nearly falling asleep during a webinar, she slumped back on her chair, frustrated. Maybe Ethan's right, she muttered to herself. But then, she remembered his laughter. The way they had already decided her fate for her. Well, she wasn't going to let them be right. She pushed forward, consuming knowledge like her life depended on it. She started experimenting with marketing strategies, building small projects, offering free consultations online just to gain experience. Then came her first real break. A small local business took a chance on her, hiring her for a short campaign. It wasn't much, but it was something. And something was all she needed to begin. She delivered results. The campaign was a success. Word spread. Another small business reached out. Then another. Slowly but surely, Emily was building something of her own. Her earnings started growing, but more than that, so did her confidence. She wasn't that girl at the dinner table anymore. She wasn't someone to be laughed at. And soon she would prove it. Chapter 3: First Steps to Success. Emily's days blurred into a relentless cycle of work, study, and quiet determination. Every morning, she endured long hours at the diner, balancing trays and forcing polite smiles. Every night, she returned to her tiny apartment, where her real work began. Her marketing knowledge grew with every webinar, every late-night research session. She analyzed ad strategies, studied consumer psychology, and tested engagement techniques. Slowly, her confidence built, not just in theory but in practice. One night, while scrolling through local business forums, she saw a post, "Looking for someone to help promote my bakery. Small budget but willing to pay." Her heart pounded. This was it. Emily typed her response carefully, introducing herself not as a beginner but as a strategist. She explained her ideas, backing them up with what she had learned. Minutes later, a reply came. "Let's talk." The next day, she sat across from Mr. Thompson, the bakery's owner. He was skeptical. "You're young," he said, eyeing her doubtfully. "No real agency experience." Emily didn't flinch. "True," she admitted. "But I understand your audience, and I know how to bring customers to your door without wasting your money. Let me prove it, just give me a week." He hesitated but finally nodded. Emily left that meeting determined. She built a campaign using social media ads, optimizing posts for engagement. She ran a contest, giving away free pastries in exchange for shares. She personally engaged with customers online. And then, it worked. By the end of the week, the bakery saw a 30% increase in foot traffic. Mr. Thompson was stunned. "You've got something, kid," he admitted, handing her an envelope. Her first real payment. It wasn't much, but it was proof. From that moment on, Emily stopped doubting herself. She refined her approach, learning from every campaign. She took on more small businesses, improving her skills and reputation. Late one night, after finishing a successful campaign for a local gym, she logged into her email and gasped. A message from a national brand. They had heard about her work and were interested. Emily sat frozen, the weight of the moment pressing down on her. She had started this journey alone, ridiculed by her own family. And now, real success was knocking on her door. She smiled to herself, exhaling slowly. This was just the beginning. Emily worked harder than ever. With every successful campaign, her reputation grew. What had started as small local projects quickly turned into something much bigger. She barely recognized her own life. Gone were the long nights of doubt and frustration. Now she had clients seeking her out, eager to work with a young marketing strategist who had a talent for making businesses thrive. Her phone buzzed constantly. Emails from potential clients, requests for meetings, updates on projects. But no one in her family knew. She had stayed quiet on purpose. She wanted them to see the results, not hear promises. One evening, after wrapping up a campaign for a boutique fashion store, she sat in her apartment, staring at her bank account. For the first time in her life, she had financial stability. She wasn't just surviving anymore. She was building something real. Her apartment had changed too. No longer the cramped, run-down space where she had started. She had upgraded to a sleek loft in the city. Minimalist, modern, a reflection of who she was becoming. Yet, despite all of this, she had told no one in her family. Not because she was afraid, because she wanted them to see it for themselves. Then, as if the universe wanted to test her, an email popped up. Subject: Parker Family Annual Dinner. Formal invitation. Her stomach twisted. She hadn't attended a family dinner since that night. Not since Ethan humiliated her. Not since Margaret dismissed her. She leaned back in her chair, staring at the screen. She didn't need their validation. She had already proven to herself that she was capable. But something inside her whispered, go. Not for revenge. Not to prove them wrong. But to stand in that room knowing she had won. Emily clicked accept. The following days were a blur of work. But in the back of her mind, the dinner lingered. She didn't know how they would react to seeing her again. Would they still treat her as the family failure? Would they even recognize how much she had changed? Finally, the night of the dinner arrived. She stood in front of her full-length mirror, adjusting the delicate black dress that hugged her frame just right. It wasn't extravagant, but it exuded quiet confidence. For the first time, she looked at herself and saw the woman she had fought to become. No more insecurity, no more doubt. She grabbed her keys and stepped outside. The city lights shimmered as she drove, her hands steady on the wheel. As she neared the Parker estate, she felt no fear. She wasn't going back as the same Emily. And by the end of the night, they would all know it. Emily pulled into the long driveway of the Parker estate, her fingers tightening around the steering wheel for just a moment. The mansion stood as grand as ever, its glowing windows casting long shadows over the neatly trimmed hedges. She took a deep breath. This time, she wasn't walking in as the same girl they had humiliated. As she stepped out of her sleek black car, a noticeable upgrade from the beat-up sedan she once owned, she caught the surprised glance of a valet. He hesitated before reaching for her keys, likely expecting her to hand them to him. She gave a polite smile and walked towards the entrance. The sound of laughter and clinking glasses hit her before she even stepped inside. The same scene, the same people, but she was different now. Inside, the dining hall gleamed under crystal chandeliers, the long mahogany table set to perfection. Guests were already mingling, sipping wine and exchanging pleasantries. Then she heard it. Emily! She turned and found herself face to face with Margaret Parker. Her aunt's perfectly lined lips parted in a mix of surprise and something else. You actually came, Margaret said, much like she had years ago. But this time, her voice wasn't condescending. It was cautious. Emily smiled. Course. It's family tradition, isn't it? Margaret studied her, eyes flicking over her outfit, her poise. Something wasn't adding up. Indeed, she murmured, forcing a tight-lipped smile before stepping aside. Emily walked further in, eyes scanning the room. Then she saw Ethan. He was at the center of a small group, laughing loudly, drink in hand, still playing the role of the golden boy. She had barely taken a step before he noticed her. His smirk froze mid-sentence. For a second, his face flickered with recognition. But then confusion settled in. Emily! His voice carried through the room, drawing attention. Heads turned. Conversations hushed. Emily met his gaze, calm and unwavering. Ethan, she greeted smoothly, tilting her head slightly. He let out a forced chuckle, shaking his head as if he couldn't believe what he was seeing. I almost didn't recognize you, he said, taking a sip of his drink. His eyes flickered over her dress, her posture, trying to place what was different. Emily simply smiled. Well, time does that. A silence stretched between them, charged and expectant. Ethan's smirk faltered. Margaret suddenly stepped in, sensing the shift. Well, come now, Emily. Find your seat. We wouldn't want you feeling out of place. It was meant to be a jab. But Emily no longer felt out of place. She walked to the dining table, where name cards were carefully arranged. Her fingers trailed over her designated seat, right next to Ethan. She let out a quiet laugh. Of course, Ethan cleared his throat as they sat. "So, Emily," he began, attempting his usual confidence. "What are you up to these days?" Emily lifted her wine glass, meeting his gaze over the rim. "Oh, you'll find out soon enough." She took a slow sip, savoring the moment. Because tonight everything would change. The dinner began with its usual formalities. Polite conversations, laughter filling the air, the occasional clinking of glasses. Emily observed everything with quiet amusement. They still thought she was the same person they had once belittled. She let them. Ethan was in his element, telling exaggerated stories about his latest business ventures, gesturing dramatically as the others nodded in approval. Emily simply listened. Then it happened. Richard, one of the older uncles, squinted at his phone and frowned. He turned to the man beside him and whispered something. Another cousin leaned in, glancing at the screen, his expression shifting. Emily took another sip of wine, watching it unfold. She didn't have to say a word. Ethan continued talking, until he noticed the sudden drop in conversation. His voice faltered as he glanced around the table. "What?" he asked, frowning. Richard cleared his throat, tapping his screen. "I was just checking something online and... well, this is interesting." He turned the phone toward Ethan. Ethan's smirk wavered as he leaned in. The color drained from his face. On the screen was an article from a major business magazine. The Rise of Emily Carter. How a former underdog built a $1 million marketing empire. Silence fell over the table. Margaret stiffened in her seat. A few guests exchanged wide-eyed glances. Emily placed her glass down carefully, a small smile forming. "Oh," she said innocently. "That article came out last week." Ethan blinked. He let out a short, forced laugh. This is you." Emily tilted her head. "Yes, Ethan. I'd assume my own cousin would recognize my name." He stared at her as if seeing her for the first time. Margaret quickly regained her composure, forcing a tight smile. "Well, that's impressive, dear," she said, though her voice lacked sincerity. Ethan, still staring at the screen, let out a disbelieving scoff. "Vic, so you're telling me you've been running a highly successful business?" Emily finished for him, raising an eyebrow. "Yes." Ethan let out another breathless laugh, shaking his head. "No way." Emily leaned forward slightly, her voice calm but firm. "Yes way." A silence settled over the table again. Some guests looked uncomfortable, others intrigued. Emily didn't gloat. She didn't need to. They all knew. She wasn't the same girl they had mocked. She had walked in tonight as someone they didn't expect, someone they had underestimated. And now, they would never look at her the same way again. Ethan sat back, rubbing a hand over his face. Margaret lifted her wine glass and took a sip, her expression unreadable. Richard gave Emily an approving nod. "Well, Emily," he said, his tone lighter than before. "I must say, it seems like you've done quite well for yourself." Emily smiled. "I have." And for the first time she felt it. She had won. A strange energy filled the dining room. The once effortless flow of conversation had been replaced by uncertainty. The people who had always dismissed Emily were now seeing her in a completely different light. She could feel it, the shift. Some of them were suddenly interested in her. Others, like Margaret, struggled to mask their discomfort. And then there was Ethan, still gripping his wine glass like it was the only thing anchoring him to reality. "So," he finally said, forcing a laugh, "guess you really did something with that little marketing thing of yours." Emily didn't flinch. "That little marketing thing just closed a deal with a Fortune 500 company last week," she said evenly. Ethan blinked, his forced confidence cracking. A murmur spread through the table. Richard raised an eyebrow. Margaret, ever the master of control, quickly composed herself. "Well," she said with a tight smile, That's quite impressive, dear. Emily took another sip of her wine, watching the way Margaret kept adjusting her napkin, how Ethan's jaw tightened. She could have taken this moment to rub it in. She could have humiliated them the way they had once humiliated her. But that wasn't who she was. She had outgrown this. I didn't come here for validation, Emily said finally, placing her glass down. Ethan scoffed, still trying to process everything. Then why did you come? Emily met his gaze, unshaken. To remind myself of how far I've come. Silence. Margaret's fingers tensed around her fork. Ethan's smirk disappeared. Emily could see it in their eyes. They weren't just surprised. They were realizing that she didn't need their approval anymore. And that was the most powerful thing of all. For years, she had wanted them to acknowledge her, to respect her. But now, she didn't care what they thought. She had built something on her own, with no one to catch her if she fell. And that was worth more than their empty praise. Richard, who had been quietly observing, finally leaned back with a chuckle. Well, I'd say that deserves a toast, he said, raising his glass. Some of the guests hesitated before following suit. Ethan. He didn't move. Margaret. She took a slow sip of her drink, her expression unreadable. Emily just smiled, lifting her glass with confidence she had never felt before. To success, Richard said. Emily held his gaze. To growth, she corrected. And as she took that sip, she knew. This was the real victory. Ethan sat stiffly in his chair, his fingers drumming against the table as the toast concluded. He had been the center of attention his whole life, always the one others admired, the golden boy of the Parker family. But tonight, Emily had taken that from him. He forced a smirk, leaning back in his seat. Well, he said, his voice carrying forced amusement. It's good to see you've finally figured something out, Em. Emily raised an eyebrow but didn't respond. Ethan wasn't congratulating her. He was clinging to whatever shred of superiority he had left. Margaret, ever composed, placed her wine glass down and turned to Emily with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. You know, dear, she said smoothly, it's wonderful that you've built something for yourself. But success can be fleeting. Emily didn't blink. Is that so? Margaret nodded. The business world is ruthless. It takes more than ambition to stay at the top. Emily smiled slightly. Ah, there it was. The last attempt to diminish her. If they couldn't dismiss her, they'd try to plant doubt instead. She met Margaret's gaze evenly. Well, I suppose I'll just have to prove you wrong, she said, her voice calm but firm. Margaret's lips pressed into a thin line. Ethan scoffed, swirling his drink. You know, it's funny. You're sitting here acting like some big deal, but I don't see you driving a Lamborghini or living in a penthouse. Emily tilted her head. Is that your definition of success, Ethan? He shrugged. Come on. You're making it sound like you've made it. But if you're still trying to prove yourself, then maybe you haven't. A few people shifted uncomfortably. The arrogance in his voice was cracking. Emily simply smiled. Success isn't about proving anything to anyone, she said. It's about knowing you've built something real. Something that lasts. Ethan scoffed. Yeah. And what if it all comes crashing down tomorrow? Emily leaned forward slightly, her eyes locked onto his. Then I'll build it again. Ethan opened his mouth, but no words came. Silence. Margaret shifted in her seat, looking away. Richard, watching the exchange, let out a low chuckle. Well, Ethan, he said, swirling his drink. Looks like you might have to rethink who the real success story is at this table. Ethan clenched his jaw. Emily sat back, completely at ease. She didn't need to win this argument. She already had. The air around the dinner table had shifted. The weight of the moment hung over everyone. But Emily felt lighter than ever. For years, she had let their opinions dictate how she saw herself. She had wanted their approval, their respect, their validation. But now, sitting here, watching Ethan struggle to maintain his composure and Margaret desperately trying to regain control, she realized something. She didn't need any of it. She had won the moment she stepped into this house without fear. The conversation at the table tried to move on, but the energy had changed. People stole glances at Emily, whispering among themselves. Some, like Richard, looked at her with something close to admiration. Others, like Margaret and Ethan, seemed restless. Margaret, ever the strategist, cleared her throat. "Well, dear, it's been lovely having you here tonight," she said smoothly. "You must be quite busy with your work." Emily caught the slight pause before Margaret chose the word work, instead of business or company. It was a deliberate choice, a way to make her success seem smaller than it was. Emily simply smiled. "Actually," she said, dabbing her napkin at the corner of her lips, "I do have a very full schedule, but I made time for this." Margaret's eyes flickered, her carefully crafted mask slipping for just a second. Ethan, who had been quiet since their last exchange, leaned forward, his smirk returning. "All right, Emily, we get it. You've made something of yourself," he said, his voice carrying an edge of irritation. "But let's be real. You wouldn't be here tonight if you didn't still care what we think." Emily tilted her head slightly, considering him. Few years ago he might have been right. Back then, she might have come here desperate to prove herself, to finally hear them say she was good enough. But now, she just smiled. "I came here to remind myself of how far I've come," she said simply. "Not to impress you." Ethan's smirk faltered. Margaret's fingers tensed slightly around her wine glass. Richard let out a quiet chuckle. "Well, I'd say mission accomplished then," he said, taking a sip of his drink. Emily glanced around the table, seeing the mix of emotions on the faces around her. Some still trying to process what they had just learned. Others clearly uncomfortable with the shift in dynamics. And in that moment, Emily made her decision. She didn't need this dinner. She didn't need their approval, their validation, or their forced congratulations. She had already won. She pushed her chair back and stood. "I think I've stayed long enough," she said, her voice calm. Margaret's eyes widened slightly. "Oh, but dessert hasn't even been served." Emily smiled. "I've had everything I needed from this evening." Ethan scoffed, shaking his head as she reached for her purse. "Oh, come on, Emily. You're really going to leave now?" Emily looked at him one last time. "I don't belong here anymore, Ethan," she said simply. "And that's the best thing I've ever realized." Without waiting for a response, she turned and walked toward the door. For the first time in her life, she was leaving this house on her own terms. And nothing had ever felt better. Emily stepped out of the Parker estate and into the cool night air. The sky stretched above her, vast and endless, a perfect reflection of how she felt in this moment, free. For the first time, she wasn't leaving this house with a heavy heart or an aching sense of not being enough. She was walking away stronger. As she reached her car, she hesitated for just a second. Not because she doubted her decision, but because she wanted to take in this exact feeling. She turned slightly, casting one last glance at the house behind her. Through the large windows, she could see the dinner continuing. The same people, the same shallow conversations, the same polite masks. But it all felt so small now. Ethan was still at the table, staring at his drink, his jaw tight. Margaret, ever composed, was saying something to another guest, but Emily could tell she was rattled. They were still trying to process what had happened tonight. And that was the best part. Emily had never needed to argue, to prove them wrong, to seek revenge. Her presence alone had done that. She took a slow breath and turned back to her car, sliding into the driver's seat. As the engine hummed to life, her phone buzzed on the console. A message from Richard. "You handled that beautifully. Proud of you." Emily smiled. Of all the people in that house, he had been the only one who had truly seen her tonight. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard for a moment before she replied, "Thank you. I needed this." She set the phone down, shifted into drive, and pulled away from the estate. The farther she got, the lighter she felt. This chapter of her life closed. She had spent years thinking she needed to prove something to them. But the truth was, she had only ever needed to prove it to herself. And she had. With one final glance at the road ahead, Emily pressed down on the gas, leaving the past exactly where it belonged, behind her. She had won. How many times have we let the opinions of others define our worth? How often have we walked away from a situation feeling small, doubting ourselves, simply because someone else made us believe we weren't good enough? Emily spent years thinking she had something to prove, but in the end, she realized the only validation that mattered was her own. Have you ever felt the same way? What would happen if, instead of trying to impress others, you focused on becoming the best version of yourself? Click on the video on the screen to continue your journey of self-discovery and see more stories that will challenge the way you think about success, confidence, and personal growth. And don't forget to subscribe so you never miss another powerful story that might just change the way you see yourself and the world around you. See you in the next video.